Hello everyone. In this video we're going to be doing a restoration on this beautiful 1934 South Bend 9-inch Toolmaker lathe. This is one of the rarest lathes that South Bend ever manufactured. It was only made for about a year and a half between 1934 and 1935. I had been looking for a small lathe for the shop, and this one came up locally. Didn't spend a lot of money on it. I do have a little bit of tooling for it, which I'll show as the video progresses, and I'll probably do a separate video on the restoration of the motor itself, because that's going to be a job just to do that. It does have the original motor with it. So anyways, hopefully you're going to enjoy following along on the refurbishment of this beautiful lathe. We're going to jump right in, starting with the tailstock. Now, to be clear, I've never done any metal lathe restorations before, so we're just going to jump in. Okay, that disassembly went okay. I'll start cleaning everything up. As to be expected, you could see some signs of usage on the bottom of the tailstock. After all, the machine's 90 years old. However, this is not abused. This is in nice shape right here. So what we're going to do is I'm going to use my precision ground tool room stones, and we're just going to go over these machine surfaces and just knock down any burrs or anything that may be abnormal on those. And that's it. I'll use the coarse side first, and then we'll go over it with the fine side. I can feel it knocking down some little burrs here and there. That's feeling better right there. Awesome. Now we're going to hit it with the fine side. Beautiful. Now on the V-ways, I have a small set of these tool room stones that I can get in there. Just carefully, I'm just going to use the fine side for that. Just carefully polish that up a little bit. Just trying to knock off any burrs or anything like that. We're not trying to file it down. Right there. Okay, good. Now I'm going to flip it over and do the other machine surfaces in the same way. So I get to use my grandfather's wood lathe to help restore our metal lathe. So I'm just polishing up some of these pieces from the tailstock. Just to remove a little bit of that galling that's on there. I'm not trying to take down the diameter of the piece, just polishing out any dings or anything that's on there. I've already gone ahead and done some of this other hardware over here. Just clean it up a little bit, nothing major. So now what I'm doing is I'm just lapping the inside of this bore here on the Morse taper, just to make sure that there's no burrs or anything like that. This lapping compound is a real fine grit, and I'm just utilizing one of my other live centers here. It's got a nice clean taper. Just going to put that on there and kind of lap these two together, and that'll make sure that the inside of that bar is nice and clean, polished. Okay, just finished off the tailstock quill with a coat of Boston polish. And once we get the tailstock housing painted, this will be ready for reassembly.
Okay, here's what we ended up with. I got everything lubricated, and I decided to paint the machine black. You know, you can't go wrong with black. If it ever needs to be touched up or anything like that in the future, it's easy to do. So now we're going to carry on. While I was working on other parts of the lathe, I wanted to do a couple quick checks to see if this motor was going to be salvageable or not. This motor is in very bad condition. You see that wiring right there, all that cloth covered wiring, how the insulation's all coming off of it? And the other thing that I noticed was when I was turning this, the rotor was rubbing, so the thing definitely needs some new bearings in there. So I took the switch apart real quick, and I just cleaned the contacts with a little contact cleaner. I didn't do a thorough cleaning, and I was able to get some movement out of the motor. So I'm starting it up with this Variac here. Let me show you. There you go. Oh, that's not good. Anyways, the restoration of the motor will be a separate video, because that's going to be a job just to take that apart and to do that correctly. Alright, so we have our countershaft assembly broken down into its main components. I'm just cleaning that up. I'm going to repaint it. One thing that I will note is that there's some lubrication wicks throughout this machine, and if you look here, you can see the little slot where those wicks fit in, and there, those wicks were missing. So I went on eBay and I bought a little rebuild kit. Looks just like that. And that kit comes with all the wicks that you would need for any model South Bend lathe, A, B, or C. So as we go, any area that's supposed to have the wicks installed, I'll make sure that the appropriate wick is replaced in there, so those will all be brand new. Anyways, I got the step pulley mounted in the lathe. I'm just going to polish that up, and we'll get this painted and put back together.
Got the counter shaft assembly back together. Got the oil wicks installed and the red fiber washers where they're needed. I didn't put the belt on there because I don't have one yet. I got that on order, so I just put it back together. When the time comes when I put the belt on there, I have to slide that pulley back off of there, but that's no big deal. Anyways, carrying on. Now I'm starting to take the bed apart. I'm going to remove the banjo and the lead screw. And then there's some nicks on the ways just from people changing the chucks over the years, but nothing that's catastrophic. So I'm going to go ahead with the precision ground flat stones, and any high areas or burrs that are on the ways, we'll go ahead and address those. These screws look like they're a little dinged up, so I'll probably replace those. But anyways, I'm going to get started on cleaning up the bed, and then I'll probably go ahead and rebuild this bench area where I'm going to remount this lathe, and then once I have the bed finished, I'll mount the bed, and then I'll start doing the headstock and the carriage, and then I'll just be able to put everything right back on the lathe as we get those pieces restored. Okay, we got the lathe bed completely broken down. Now what I'm doing is I'm just polishing up the ways a little bit and hitting them with the precision ground flat stones. I'm not doing anything crazy. Unless you have the skill set and the proper equipment to scrape in these ways and get them all true to each other and to the carriage and to the headstock and to the tailstock, honestly you're better off just to give them a light going over, hit them with the precision ground flat stones, remove any burrs, anything like that, and that's it. You know, the lathe is 90 years old. There's always going to be a little bit of wear in there. If you want to make parts for NASA, you know, you better get a new lathe than that one that's 90 years old. So anyways, we're just going to take a conservative approach when it comes to these ways. And to be honest with you, these lathes are pretty durable, you know, and I think most of the time a conservative approach is the best approach, unless you really have the equipment to do something more in depth. For any high spots, you know, there are some areas in the bedways here where the chuck, you know, has hit the waves over the years. Just making sure that none of that stuff is sticking up and causing a problem when the carriage travels over it. If you look closely at the ways, you can see where some areas are a little bit shinier than the others. And that's where those tool room stones have removed any uneven areas in the ways. So they really do a good job. So the oil is really hard and dried up on the threads of the lead screw. I was trying to get in there with a piece of twine and just clean in between the threads, but that didn't work too good. So what I ended up doing was filling up this piece of PVC pipe with some purple power degreaser. I'm going to let that soak in there overnight, and that'll get rid of all that grease. I'm also working on a couple accessories that I have for this lathe. There's a thread dial, a carriage stop, a steady rest. There's nothing wrong with these accessories. I'm just taking them apart and repainting them. So that's just routine painting right there. So anyways, we're making good progress. In between other aspects of the lathe restoration, I'm working on a base for the lathe to sit on. I'm hoping that this lathe is going to share this base with my little wood lathe. Wood lathe is not real heavy, so that's not really a concern. Anyways, I have these nice cast iron legs here made by Delta, and those of course are made for a lathe. In the book How to Run a Lathe by South Bend, they recommend if you're going to use a wooden base that the wooden base be at least 2 inches thick, but I'm actually going to go heavier than that. So I'm going to laminate a couple 2x12s together, which will give that a thickness of at least 3 inches. So that should be more than adequate for this little 36-inch bed. So I'm going to carry on with the construction of the base. That'll make it easier to put everything back together as I complete the components. I could just start mounting them right up on the table. It's a hell of a lot easier than cutting those things by hand. Got about 7 more to go. So we got our bench top completely glued up. We got carriage bolts in there also as a secondary fastener. So once this thing is done, it's going to be rock solid. Getting the table itself dialed in using the level, and then once we got the lathe mounted, we'll go ahead and we will get that leveled as well. So far so good. Got a couple of coats of varnish on the bench, and it came out real nice, so you can see it's still a little bit wet there. So we'll let that dry good, and then we can start putting things into position. Thing I noticed is this piece here is completely locked up. That's supposed to turn, but it's frozen, so get that freed up somehow. Okay, we are getting a little movement out of that shaft. I'm just using this brass hammer on there so it's not going to do any damage to the pieces. That heat seems to have helped. Boom. Success. Okay, I got this in my copper jaws. I'm gonna try to get this hand wheel off of here. It looks like it's threaded on there. There it goes. We got the saddle broken down as far as it'll go. Now we're gonna start cleaning everything up, repairing anything that needs to be repaired, and replacing the lubrication wicks and the felt way wipers at the same time. I noticed a few different hairline cracks in this plate, which is used to lock down the saddle. Somebody probably over tightened those bolts over the years and it just started to crack. So of course these could be ground out and you could braze that, but it'd just be easier for me just to make a new one out of steel. So I'm just gonna go ahead and trace these out and just make a new piece for that. There's the old locking plate, and here's the new one we just fabricated, working like a charm. Right now I'm cleaning up all the parts for the saddle, just cleaning them, polishing them up a little bit, deburring anything that needs to be deburred. So far there hasn't been any major surprises. I didn't see any pieces with any catastrophic failures or anything like that, nothing that needs to be replaced. And while I'm doing that, as I mentioned earlier, I'm replacing this felt. That's a brand new one in there. I just put some oil on it and I put some new felt on those way wipers. So I'll just continue working at that. So far everything's coming along good. Additionally, as we continue to work on these parts, of course everything's getting painted as necessary. Now I'm installing that locking plate we fabricated a while ago. I already got the 3 bolts lightly screwed in there. Now this is the bolt that actually locks it down. Put this in here and we'll give it a little test run, make sure it's working okay. Okay, that feels like it's locked down. And it is. Okay. So that's working out just fine. Loosen it back up. Okay, good. So we got the carriage assembly finished up, no major problems there. The only thing I'll have to look into is, it looks to me that there should be a shoe that goes between this bolt and the gib on this, and that appears to be missing, so I'll have to make something out of brass or whatever. That's not a big deal. But everything else is done with that. And then while I was at it, I put the lead screw on there. The lead screw is just held in place with 2 screws here and 2 screws on the end there, so nothing overly complicated there. And as you can see, that banjo is a simplified banjo. It's just got 1 spur coming off of it, as opposed to some of the later models had more like a Y shape. So anyways, the next phase of the project is going to be the headstock. As to be expected, there's a little bit of galling in the bearing area. Kind of see that there. But, you know, for 90 years old, it's not too bad. So let's carry on with the disassembly. So we got the headstock assembly chucked up in the wood lathe, and I'm just polishing up these pulleys. And in the areas where the shaft rides on the bearings, I'm just going to hit those with like some 600 grit sandpaper. Obviously you don't want to take those down any more than absolutely necessary, so nothing major as far as those are concerned. Any little grooves that are in there, that'll actually retain oil, so it's not as bad as it would seem on the surface. So I'll go ahead and continue working on that. Okay, we're making some good progress on our headstock spindle. I got this thing completely cleaned up. I decided against pressing this pulley off the shaft there, and the reason why I decided against that is because there is some galling on these bearing surfaces here. You know, it's not ideal, but the machine is 90 years old, so it's not surprising. And anytime that you're pressing something apart where there's galling involved, you run the risk that something could catch on there and you could actually exacerbate the problem. So you have to weigh what is the risk versus what is the reward. There's really no major reward if I took this thing apart other than to say I had it apart. But the safest option, and the option that we're going to take, is just leave that assembled. I cleaned everything around it and lubricated it, and so we're going to call that good right there, because I don't want to risk damaging that bearing surface any more than it already is. As far as the gear train over here is concerned, we got this completely broken down, and in this area there's 3 of those lubrication wicks which we're replacing. There's a long one that fits inside here, and there's 2 short ones that fit here and here. So we got our wicks there. We're going to get those cut and replaced, and we'll get this thing put back together. So this is the belt that I ended up going with. It's made by Goodyear. It's a 42.5-inch belt. It's a serpentine belt, and it fits the pulley perfectly. It's what they call a 7V belt. And 42.5 is about as short as you could possibly go without the motor, you know, interfering with the lathe. So I wanted to try to keep that as compact as possible, where this thing wasn't hanging too far off the workbench on the back side. So right now this pulley, it hangs a few inches off the back, but it's not bad. So once we get that tensioner on there, I already done some test fitting. I got these lag bolts in here and I was kind of moving things around. I made up a tensioner, which I'm working on getting that finished, and that should work out just fine the way it is. One of the things I was most curious about was how much play was in the spindle bearings. The spindle bearings are integral to the headstock. In other words, the actual cast iron from the headstock serves as the bearing on this particular model. Some of the later models had removable bearings, and some of them had shims that you could take out, but not this one. So a recommended tolerance on that is about 0.002. So I put this heavy piece of steel in here. I got the dial indicator zeroed out there, and I'm going to lift up on it and see how much movement we get out of that. And when I lift up on this, okay, we're getting about
2 thousandths of movement on that, maybe just a tiny bit over. And I'm really lifting up hard on this thing. So that's pretty darn respectable, you know, given the age of the machine. So I'm real happy with that. So even though there was a little bit of galling on those surfaces, it didn't have a negative impact on the tolerances. We're gonna wrap up part 1 of this video, and I will be releasing a follow-up video, part number 2, which will detail the restoration of the motor and also be taking our first cuts with the machine. I still have to do some additional checking, for example, the ways to see how much wear is in there. But overall, I was pretty pleased with the amount of wear that was in the parts, given the age of the machine. So anyways, let me take you for a walk around here and you can kind of see where we're at. So we got our steady rest and follow rest there. I got the thread dial put on there. Got a carriage stop there. I don't have any of the change gears on there yet, but I have a complete set of change gears for them, including the compound gears, which will allow you to do a finer feed rate. The way that I set up the workstation here is I have a few different toolboxes down here. I have one that has some indicators and micrometers and things like that. This one has some different chucks and different parts for the wood lathe and a couple pieces for the metal lathe in there. We got some oil cans down there, of course. And then over here, we have some of our cutting tools for the metal lathe and reamers. And, it's not finished, the tooling is not finished yet. I'm just getting started on it. Got some drill bits up there, but it'll come together. It just takes a little bit of time and money. Here's the wood lathe. If you'll recall, we set up the bench so that the 2 lathes could occupy the same workstation. And I tell you, with these 2 machines on there and with the way that I got this designed with these toolboxes down here and everything filled up, I mean, it's really heavy. So it's a nice, solid machine. Plus, with those cast iron legs, I mean, the whole thing is really nice and rigid and heavy. So that's what you want to have when you have a lathe. Here's our counter shaft assembly. Of course, we're still going to put the motor on there. But you can see that our tensioner that we made is working out fine. All right, so we'll see you guys in part 2. Thank you very much for watching.